Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Don't shoot my brother. Audra's scream tore through the cavernous living room like shattered glass, the words erupting from a place so raw and buried that even she did not recognize her own voice at first, because in that instant when Victor raised the gun and aimed it squarely at Matt's chest, time fractured into jagged pieces and the years Audra had spent running from the truth collapsed into a single, unavoidable moment. One where lies could no longer shield her and silence would be a death sentence, and as Victor's finger tightened on the trigger, Audra stepped between them without thinking, her arms spread wide as if her body alone could hold back fate, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst, and she shouted again, louder, desperate, "Don't shoot my brother," a confession hurled like a grenade into the room, detonating decades of secrets in an instant, and Victor froze, his eyes narrowing, confusion flickering across his face before hardening into suspicion, the gun still raised but wavering now, because Victor had lived long enough to recognize the sound of truth breaking free, and Audra, breathless and shaking, stared back at him, knowing there was no turning back, knowing that once spoken, the truth would reshape every life it touched, including her own, and Matt's, and Victor's, and everyone who had been orbiting this dark secret without ever knowing its gravity. Audra swallowed hard, her throat burning, and began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rush as though if she slowed down even for a second, she would lose the courage to continue, and she told Victor that Matt was not just some pawn or enemy or disposable obstacle in one of Victor's endless wars, but her biological brother, flesh of her flesh, blood of her blood, born of the same mother whose name Audra had spent her entire life refusing to say out loud, because that name carried with it shame, fear, abandonment, and a past Audra had rebuilt herself to escape, and as she spoke, memories flooded her mind in vivid, merciless detail, a cramped hospital room heavy with antiseptic and whispered arguments, a mother pale and exhausted, clutching a newborn baby boy while another infant, Audra herself, lay in a bassinet nearby, the sound of rain against the window, the decision that would fracture their family forever, the deal made in desperation that one child would be given away. Erased, hidden, while the other would remain, and Audra's voice trembled as she explained how she had discovered the truth years later, how she had pieced together fragments of conversations, faded documents, a birth certificate altered with deliberate care, how she had confronted her mother only to be met with tears and pleas for forgiveness, how she had learned that Matt had grown up believing he was unwanted, abandoned, cast aside without explanation, while Audra had been raised in a world that taught her to survive by becoming sharp, controlled, and emotionally armored, and Victor listened, his expression shifting from disbelief to grim comprehension as Audra continued, her confession spilling out like a confession and a plea intertwined, because she told him that Matt's anger, his recklessness, his hunger for revenge, all of it stemmed from that original wound, that first betrayal, and that even as adults, even as enemies caught on opposite sides of Victor's endless battles, they were still bound by something older and stronger than any grudge Victor held, and she begged him to understand that shooting Matt would not just eliminate a threat but annihilate what little family Audra had left, that it would shatter her in ways no amount of power or success could ever repair. Matt, standing just feet away, stared at Audra in stunned silence, his mind reeling, because this was not how he had imagined the truth coming out, not in front of Victor, not with a gun aimed at his heart, and he searched Audra's face for any sign of deception, but all he saw was terror and love and an unmistakable familiarity mirrored in her eyes, and suddenly memories he had never fully understood surged to the surface, the sense of recognition he had always felt around Audra, the inexplicable pull, the way her victories had sometimes felt like his own and her betrayals had cut deeper than they should have, and Victor's grip on the gun loosened slightly as the weight of Audra's words settled over him, because Victor was many things, ruthless, calculating, merciless, but he was not immune to the power of blood ties, not after a lifetime defined by family loyalties and betrayals, and he demanded proof, his voice low and dangerous, and Audra nodded, already reaching into her bag with shaking hands, producing the DNA report she had carried like a talisman and a curse, the document she had sworn never to reveal, and she handed it to Victor, who scanned it quickly, his jaw tightening as the undeniable evidence stared back at him, confirming that Matt and Audra shared the same mother, the same genetic markers, the same origin story that had been stolen from them both. The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by Audra's ragged breathing, and Victor lowered the gun slowly, not out of mercy alone but out of calculation, because he now understood that killing Matt would cost him Audra, and Audra was not just an ally or a pawn but a woman whose loyalty, once secured, could be absolute, and whose betrayal, if provoked, could be catastrophic. And he also understood that this revelation altered the entire chessboard, because blood complicates everything. And Victor had built his empire on understanding leverage, and family was the most volatile leverage of all. Audra, sensing the shift, pressed her advantage, stepping closer to Victor, her voice softer now but no less intense, and she told him that she had spent her life choosing ambition over vulnerability, strategy over sentiment, but that in this moment she was choosing truth over survival, because she could not live with Matt's death on her conscience, not knowing what she now knew, not after realizing that every cruel word she had ever spoken to him, every scheme she had orchestrated against him, had been an act of self-betrayal as much as betrayal of him, and she confessed that part of her had always known, had always sensed the connection, but that she had buried it under layers of denial because acknowledging it would have forced her to confront her own past, her own abandonment, her own fear of being unlovable. Victor studied her carefully, seeing not the polished strategist he was accustomed to but a woman stripped bare by truth, and for the first time, he saw how dangerous that truth could be, because it had the power to unravel alliances, to inspire loyalty beyond reason, to drive people to acts of heroism or destruction without regard for consequence, and Matt finally found his voice, asking Audra why she had never told him, why she had let him believe he was alone, and Audra turned to him, tears streaming down her face, and told him that she had been afraid that if she acknowledged him as her brother, she would lose the life she had built, afraid that loving him would make her weak, afraid that he would hate her for knowing the truth and saying nothing, and she admitted that she had been wrong, devastatingly wrong, and that every day she had lived with that silence had been another day stolen from both of them. Victor exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with grudging acceptance, and he holstered the gun, declaring that this changed things, not out of kindness but because strategy demanded adaptation, and he warned them both that blood did not absolve betrayal, that family ties could be exploited as easily as any other weakness, and Audra nodded, fully aware of the bargain implicit in his words, but she did not flinch, because for the first time in her life, she had chosen something other than power, and the choice felt terrifying and liberating all at once. As Victor left the room, his footsteps echoing like punctuation at the end of a chapter no one had anticipated, Audra and Matt were left standing amid the wreckage of their former lives, staring at each other across a gulf of years and lies, and Audra whispered again, "I'm your sister," as if saying it might make it real, and Matt's expression hardened before softening, anger and grief and longing warring within him, because the revelation did not erase the pain of abandonment or the harm they had done to each other, but it reframed it, giving shape to wounds that had never healed properly because they had never been named, and in that moment, Audra understood that saving Matt's life was only the beginning, that the truth she had unleashed would ripple outward, altering alliances, provoking enemies, and forcing her to confront parts of herself she had long kept hidden, and she also understood that family was not a guarantee of forgiveness, only an opportunity for it, and as Matt finally lowered his gaze and nodded once, not in absolution but in acknowledgement, Audra felt the fragile possibility of redemption flicker into existence, knowing it could be extinguished at any moment, but also knowing that for the first time, she was willing to fight for it, even if it cost her everything she had ever built, because some truths, once spoken, demand sacrifice, and some bonds, once revealed, refuse to be ignored, and as the echo of her desperate cry, "Don't shoot my brother," lingered in the air, Audra realized that those words had not only saved Matt's life but irrevocably changed her own, binding her future to a past she could no longer outrun, and setting into motion consequences that would test the limits of loyalty, power, and love in ways none of them could yet fully comprehend. The silence that followed Victor's departure was not peaceful but charged, thick with everything that had been left unsaid for decades, and Audra felt it pressing against her chest as she stood there with Matt, the man she had spent years seeing as an adversary, a threat, a mirror she refused to look into, now revealed as her brother, a word that felt strange and fragile on her tongue, heavy with meaning and obligation, and she realized that the confession had not ended anything at all but had instead begun something far more dangerous and uncertain, because truths of this magnitude do not simply settle, they demand reckoning, and Matt's eyes, dark and searching, held questions Audra knew she could not answer easily or quickly, questions about childhood stolen, about choices made in silence, about whether blood alone could bridge the abyss carved by years of deception and mutual harm. Matt broke the silence first, his voice controlled but edged with a bitterness he made no effort to hide, asking her how long she had known, and Audra hesitated only a fraction of a second before answering honestly, telling him she had known for years, long enough for the truth to rot inside her, long enough for guilt to become a constant companion she had learned to ignore in order to survive, and she watched his jaw tighten, the muscle jumping as anger flared in his eyes, because knowing that she had lived with the truth while he had lived with lies felt like a second betrayal layered cruelly atop the first, and he accused her of using him, of letting him fight battles he never would have chosen had he known who he truly was to her, and Audra did not deny it, because denial would only deepen the wound, so she told him that she had been selfish, that she had believed she could keep the truth compartmentalized, that she could be Audra the strategist and Audra the sister in separate worlds that would never collide, and she admitted that she had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. Matt laughed then, a short, humorless sound, and said that wrong did not begin to cover it, that while she had been climbing, consolidating power, making deals with men like Victor, he had been chasing ghosts, trying to understand why he always felt like half of himself was missing, why anger came so easily to him, why trust felt like a trap, and as he spoke, Audra felt each word land like a blow, because she recognized herself in his pain, recognized the same fractured sense of identity she had spent years trying to outrun, and she realized that their shared blood had not just bound them genetically but had shaped them in eerily similar ways, molding them into survivors who used control as a shield against abandonment. She told him then about their mother, not the sanitized version she had once told herself but the messy, painful truth, about a woman trapped by fear and circumstance, about the pressures that had led to an impossible choice, about the guilt that had haunted her until her last breath, and she did not ask for forgiveness on their mother's behalf, because she knew that forgiveness could not be demanded, only offered, and even then, only when the wound was ready to close. Matt listened, his expression unreadable, and when Audra finished, he said quietly that understanding the reason did not erase the damage, and Audra nodded, agreeing, because she was done pretending that explanations could heal what had been broken, and instead she offered him something else, something far more difficult, accountability, promising that from this moment forward, she would not hide behind strategy or ambition when it came to him, that she would face whatever consequences the truth brought, even if it meant losing everything she had fought for. Outside the room, the machinery of Victor's empire continued to hum, unaware that its balance had shifted, and Audra knew that Victor would not let this revelation sit idle, that he would analyze it, weaponize it if necessary, and she warned Matt of this, telling him that Victor now saw them not as individuals but as a unit, a vulnerability that could be exploited, and Matt scoffed at the idea of being Victor's leverage, saying he had spent his entire life being someone else's collateral damage. But Audra insisted that this time was different, because now they knew the truth, and knowledge, even painful knowledge, was power. She proposed an uneasy alliance, not as enemies forced together by circumstance but as siblings choosing, consciously and deliberately, to protect one another in a world that would gladly tear them apart, and Matt regarded her skeptically, pointing out the irony of hearing that word, protect, from the woman who had once orchestrated his downfall without hesitation, and Audra accepted the accusation without defense, telling him that trust could not be rebuilt with words alone, only with action. And that she was prepared to prove herself, step by step, no matter how long it took. As the hours passed and the initial shock began to dull, the weight of what lay ahead grew clearer, because the revelation of their shared blood was not confined to that room, and secrets that involve powerful men and fragile alliances have a way of leaking, of finding daylight despite the most careful efforts to contain them, and Audra knew that when others learned the truth, it would force a reckoning across the entire landscape, shifting loyalties, reigniting old vendettas, and creating new ones, and she understood that some would see their bond as a weakness to exploit, while others might see it as a reason to fear them, because united, they represented something unpredictable and potentially unstoppable. Matt, for his part, struggled with the idea of family in any form, having learned early that attachment often led to pain, and he admitted that part of him wanted to walk away, to disappear, to sever ties before they could entangle him further, but another part, quieter yet more persistent, wanted answers, wanted connection, wanted to know what it meant to belong to someone not by choice or convenience but by blood, and Audra saw that conflict play out in his eyes, recognizing it as the same one she had lived with her entire life, the tug-of-war between self-preservation and longing. She told him that she could not promise an easy path, that being her brother would not shield him from danger but might instead draw more of it, and she acknowledged that if he chose to walk away, she would not stop him, because she had already taken too much from him, but Matt surprised her by saying that walking away would only prove that the past still controlled him, and that if he was going to confront his demons, he would do it head-on, even if it meant standing beside the sister who had once been his enemy. Their tentative understanding was interrupted when Victor summoned Audra, and as she walked through the corridors of his domain, she felt the familiar sensation of being observed, evaluated, weighed for usefulness, and she steeled herself, knowing that Victor would test her loyalty now more than ever, probing for cracks he could exploit, and when she entered his office, she found him calm, almost contemplative, which unsettled her more than anger would have, because Victor's calm always preceded decisive action. He told her that blood complicated things but did not absolve anyone of their past actions, and he asked her, bluntly, where her loyalties lay now, and Audra met his gaze without flinching, telling him that her loyalty was to the truth she had just spoken, and that while she would continue to honor her commitments, she would not sacrifice her brother to prove her usefulness. And Victor studied her for a long moment before smiling thinly, remarking that conviction made people dangerous, and that he admired it even as he planned around it. He warned her that protecting Matt would come at a cost, that enemies would test her resolve, that alliances would fray, and that she would be forced to choose again and again between expedience and principle, and Audra accepted this without hesitation, because she had already made the first and hardest choice when she stepped between the gun and her brother. When she returned to Matt, she relayed Victor's warning, and instead of fear, she saw resolve settle into Matt's posture, as though the truth had given him something he had never possessed before, a sense of purpose not defined solely by anger or survival, and he told her that if they were going to face what came next, they needed to be honest not just about the past but about the present, about the ways they had hurt others, the enemies they had made, the lines they had crossed, and Audra agreed, recognizing that rebuilding anything on a foundation of half-truths would only recreate the same patterns that had led them here. Over the following days, they spoke more openly than either ever had with anyone else, sharing fragments of their lives that felt both foreign and eerily familiar, discovering parallels in their coping mechanisms, their ambition, their mistrust, and even their moments of unexpected compassion, and while the conversations were often painful, they also carried a strange sense of relief, as though naming the truth allowed old wounds to breathe for the first time. Audra began to understand that being a sister was not about erasing the past or pretending that love alone could fix everything, but about showing up consistently, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it cost her, and Matt began to realize that accepting her as his sister did not mean excusing her actions but acknowledging that their story was bigger than any single betrayal. As word of the revelation slowly spread through whispered conversations and guarded glances, reactions varied from shock to skepticism to calculated interest, and Audra navigated this shifting terrain with care, aware that every move she made now reflected not just on herself but on Matt as well, and she found herself recalibrating her instincts, weighing decisions not only for strategic advantage but for their impact on someone else's life, a change that unsettled and grounded her in equal measure. Matt, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning, confronting the rage that had fueled him for so long and questioning whether it still served him now that he understood its origin, and while he did not become gentler overnight, he began to channel that intensity with greater intention, choosing his battles more carefully, aware that recklessness now carried consequences beyond himself. Together, they stood at the edge of an uncertain future, bound by a truth that had nearly cost one of them his life, and Audra often replayed the moment she had screamed for Victor not to shoot, realizing that in that instant, she had finally acted without calculation, without armor, driven solely by instinct and love, and she understood that while the path ahead would be fraught with danger, betrayal, and sacrifice. It would at least be honest, and that honesty, however painful, offered a chance at something she had never truly believed in before, redemption not through power, but through connection. And as she and Matt prepared to face the consequences of the truth together, Audra knew that the words, "Don't shoot my brother," were no longer just a desperate plea shouted in a moment of terror, but a promise she would spend the rest of her life trying to keep, no matter the cost.